Hello everyone, this is Kale with Throneness, and today I am continuing my series on meditations on the tarot. Specifically, I am going over the second major arcana in Tomberg's ordering, which is the High Priestess. So I will show this on the screen for a little bit. You'll notice that she is wearing a 3-layer tiara, she is seated, and she has an open book. We'll touch on a little bit of that, but in every single chapter, Tomberg does break down the visual symbolism. I might not get into it a ton, though, because there is so much information here, and it's really hard to distill and really convey to people in a sensible manner. There's so many tangents that Tomberg goes on. So I've had to reorder things and whatnot. So let's get into it. So the second card, right, the High Priestess, it builds upon the first card, okay, the Magician. Now, whereas the Magician is all about how to spontaneously detect spiritual realities via the analogical method, right, mysticism, the High Priestess is about how to communicate these realities via memory and the written word, right, the book that she has. The Magician is bringing higher things down, okay, and the High Priestess is about sharing those things with others, right, so it can be reflected back up, right? So the Magician is bringing it down, High Priestess is reflecting it up. Now, this reflection, Tomberg describes as gnosis, because he says that gnosis is a type of knowledge that is a reflection of that which is above, okay? And then he says that science is a type of knowledge that is an interpretation of the things that are below, okay? So he says that the High Priestess is all about gnosis in particular, the reflection of that which is above. He says the Magician dares to stand, right? The Magician is standing at the table, and he says this is a mystical act. The priestess, the High Priestess, in comparison, knows and sits, whereas sitting is relating vertically and horizontally, okay? Remember the typological memory, okay, and she has mythological memory, just like the analogy. So, Tomberg brings up the verse in the Bible, unless one is born of water and spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom. Now, what are these in Tomberg's mind, right? He says that spirit is the detection, right, like the Magician, and water is the reflection, which is the High Priestess, okay? Unless you're born of water and spirit, reflection and detection, right, you can't enter the kingdom, okay? So mystical experience transforms into higher knowledge. The Magician flows into the High Priestess, okay? These are intimately related. Now, how does this mystical experience transform into gnosis or higher knowledge? How does that happen? Well, I think the clue is related to the High Priestess being female. So throughout this chapter, sprinkled hints about this. Tomberg says that, well, Tomberg points out that women are physically feminine, passive, okay, but they are spiritually masculine, okay, active. Now, and on the flip side, you know, men are physically masculine and spiritually feminine, okay? So women are physically feminine but spiritually masculine, okay? And then he says that pure intellect is that which reflects, okay? So the High Priestess has pure intellect, right? Because she reflects. And love is that which acts, okay? So love is that which is coming down, and the pure intellect is reflecting up. Okay, so naturally, Tomberg says that intellect is a feminine part of the soul, while love and imagination is a masculine part of the soul. So intellect, being feminine, must be fertilized by love or imagination, which is masculine. Okay? So this is classic Hermeticism, right? If you get weirded out by this, just know that this is very typical of Hermetic thought in general. You know, the kind of symbolic reading of these things, right? Okay, so the female intellect must be fertilized by love, right? So the love comes down, right, is detected, and the intellect reflects it up. So Tomberg uses a term called Christian yoga to describe the process portrayed by the High Priestess, right? Now, Christian yoga might be a red flag for you. You're thinking, oh, New Age, this is weird, right? But Tomberg clarifies, right? So Christian yoga is not the following things. It is not radical deliverance, mukti, as the Hindus would say. It's not non-duality, Advaita, which I think is Buddhist. It's not monism or radical oneness, which is like Spinoza. And Christian yoga is not Manichaeism or Gnosticism, otherwise known as dualism, but rather Christian yoga is the unity of two, right? Which he says is the way of love, okay? So from here, Tomberg is going to explain in a number of ways what he means by this unity of two, the way of love, right? What is Christian yoga? So first, he's going to explain a little bit about what love is versus what being is with a capital B, right? And then he's going to talk about these different kinds of paths that one can take, right? It's a choice of paths. So, right, because you can choose the way of love or the way of being, right? So what is love? Tomberg first brings up this verse in the New Testament. God is love, and he who abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. Right? This is a very popular verse, right? God is love. But what does that mean exactly? Well, Tomberg points out one popular way of talking about the Trinity, right? Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And he says in an Augustinian fashion, he says, the Father is the loving one who loves, the Son is the loved one who loves, and the Holy Spirit is their love who loves them. Okay? So that's kind of his idea of what that means. God is love. A communion, right? A relation. Another important thing that Tomberg says about love is that it is subjective. Okay, so it requires experience and relationship in order to truly conceive of what it is, right? So love is subjective because it requires experience to understand it. Now, on the flip side, what is being, right? In the same way, there are verses in the Bible that set up God as being, right? The famous I am that I am in the Old Testament when God talks to Moses. This kind of sets up and introduces God as being, right? As the ground of being. I am that I am. So, okay, all right. So you have two different conflicting verses there, maybe, we'll see. But later on, right, or in other places, the picture becomes a bit clearer. Right, Tomberg talks about how, well, I think that it's the ground of being is put in the context of love in other places, okay? So it's like being is the ground floor and love is layered on top of that, okay? So another thing that Tomberg points out about being is that on the flip side of love, it is actually objective, right? So love is subjective, being is objective, and morally neutral, because being doesn't require much experience to really understand it, right? Whereas love kind of requires experience there. So you have a choice, right? Love or being. which one is supreme? Well, Tomberg obviously goes with love, right? He sees this as the Christian path. He says, being without love would be hell, right? And that's basically how, that is the description of hell in a lot of classical terms, right? Just existence without love, right? So Tomberg says the fact of the incarnation of Jesus and the crucifixion of Jesus, these facts prove that love is greater than being, okay? So for the Christian, right, the Christian has to think that love surpasses being in some sense, okay? So what would it be like if you would choose the path of being over the path of love, right? Well, Tomberg says that if you choose being, you're essentially choosing a search for true being, right? Because you're always just going to be looking for more true being. What is the truth, right? And basically this war ensues and only one thing can win, right? And any kind of thing that you determine to be false being is going to be cut off, right? It has to be. So you're removing that process of removal of the false being, right? One aspect of that is Tomberg points out, you lose the ability to cry, right? In the Vedanta or in yoga, there are no tears, right? Because you're removing the false being. Now, in contrast, if you choose the way of love or the path of love, like in the Kabbalah or in Christian mysticism, they often speak of the gift of tears. Tears are essential. It's tears because you're overwhelmed by joy and by divine love without being absorbed by it, right? What does this mean exactly, right? The human person is not extinguished, but rather set ablaze, right? Which reminds me of Blaise Pascal, actually. He wrote a poem, and I'll just read a couple of lines from it, but the poem starts off with the word fire. It just says fire, right? He talks about, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, not of the philosophers and of the learned, joy, 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 tears of joy. So Blaise Pascal had this experience, and this experience of divine love, and it involved tears and joy and being overwhelmed, right? And he kind of honed in on that fire word, right? The person is set ablaze. So basically the path of love, right? And the conflict in the great I am, right? I think that Moses, when he recorded the first 5 books of the Bible or whatever, I think that he sets up the great I am, the ground of being, as an objective basis for growing in the subjective experience of love, which is the higher ideal that truly is, okay? So you have the great I am, ground of being, but it's a basis for growth and experience of the subjective love, right? I mean, contrast, it's not really even a contrast because they don't contradict, but set up the great I am, and then, not too long after you have the Psalms and David, right, which is obviously an experience of radical divine love, both in the Old Testament, right? So in the Christian world, yes, love is superior to being, okay? And then Tomberg talks about how Jesus says at one point, all who have come before me are thieves and robbers, okay? So what does this mean exactly? Well, Tomberg quotes Goethe here, and he says, the highest treasure of the children of earth is surely the personality. Now, what is a personality? Well, it's something that you can relate to, right? Something that you can love, right? Others, so all who have come before me are thieves and robbers, compared to Jesus, right? Why is that? Well, the people that came before Jesus, they just initiated you into being, right? The search for true being. They did not initiate you into love, right? So they chose the path of being, right? And that ends up in depersonalization, right? The Stoics, the Buddha, etc. And if you don't have a personality, you can't relate, right? There's no love there. Now, Jesus also said, I have come that they may have life. Okay? So Tomberg kind of goes on a little tangent about this as well. What does that mean exactly? Well, it's not about, in the Christian conception, it's not about a great life or a little life, right? It's neither the will to power greatness of Nietzsche or Nietzsche's little slave morality smallness, right? I have come that they may have life is just life itself, okay? So Tomberg says that God's sheep, right, the sheep that he cares for, it's just three things: a living entity surrounded by dangers, which is the object of divine care, okay? It's just about love and the master's care for you, not psychology, not philosophy, not science. It's just as simple as that. Now, at this point in the chapter, Tomberg goes into a little bit of a offshoot about substance and essence and how it relates to love. And this gets very complex, but he basically talks about how there is a separation between these concepts in the classical world, between substance and essence, right? He says that two substances, right, substances remain separate as long as they lack free alliance in love. They remain separate if they don't have free alliance in love. And love is two substances meeting and being united in one essence, okay? Substances being united in one essence, right? And this gets very complex, and I don't know completely the application of it here, but he basically says that the one essence, right? Because he quotes Augustine, and Augustine says that really we should only apply the word essence to God. Everything else is a substance. God is the only essence, okay? And I don't truly understand it, but there is kind of a divide here that Tomberg uses between substance, which would be like created beings, and essence, right? The great one essence. So thinking about like a chart, right? Two different things over here. All right, so you have substance here and you have essence here, okay? Under the substance, you have reality, being, he who is, right? And then on the essence, you have ideal, love, and the great Ein Sof, which is, eternal, ultimate, right? So he's basically just illustrating this concept of these two separate terms that should remain separate and the kind of related concepts with them. And he applies this in how we'll see down here. He says, talking about the beatific vision, there's a verse in the Bible that says, no one has ever seen God, okay? Because Tomberg says, no one has contemplated God in the realm of essence while maintaining their own personality, right? We're over here the substance, God is over here the great one essence, right? No one has ever seen God because no one has contemplated God in this realm, right? And he says then the beatific vision of someone like Thomas Aquinas, right, is essentially an encounter in the domain of essence while fully actualizing and remaining intact in the human personality. And this is the great mystery, right? And that's like in The Magician, that's what he talked about was the great alchemical work, right? It's a great mystery. Now, this next part is very much about epistemology and knowing and a kind of holistic hermetic outlook on life. It's very cool, but the reason that this topic is kind of an offshoot here is because the High Priestess is all about gnosis, right? So in the whole last bit I talked about, we were explaining how the gnosis occurs, right? The Christian yoga, as Tomberg describes it. Now, now he's going to talk about what the gnosis really even is, okay? So, fundamental Hermetic epistemology is this. Each object of knowledge demands a method of knowledge which is proper to it, okay? This is really important to grasp, okay? Because this is a really big complaint I have about a lot of schools of thought today. They try to oversimplify and boil things down to one method, one system. Like this simple system explains everything, right? What happens is it becomes a way to cope with a complex world by lying to yourself and telling yourself that it's not complex, right? And one example that Tomberg gives of this is cybernetic psychology. It tries to talk about psychology by relating it to material cybernetic terms, right? So each object of knowledge demands a method of knowledge which is proper to it, okay? So part of understanding this, right, the correct method proper to all these things, is understanding that a tradition needs to be a complete organism, right? If it's not a complete integrated organism, it decays and it dies, okay? And what do I mean by that? Well, firstly, he says, Tomberg says, autonomous systems are spells and psychopathy. Did I say that right? Psychopathy? Psychopathy? Yes. But basically, he goes on to give some examples. For example, a Marxist of today, and he was writing in like the 40s or something like that. He says, a Marxist of today is incapable of seeing anything else in the history of mankind other than the class struggle, right? So basically, he's describing autonomous systems as being one tiny little piece of a puzzle, right? And you're trying to understand the whole world with that one tiny piece of the puzzle, right? So it becomes this kind of spell that you put on yourself. And he gives another example about Freudians. He says, well, to the Freudian, everything is about a repressed libido, right? The only reason that Tomberg is interested in tarot cards is because he has a repressed sexuality, right? And he says it's the same thing with the Hegelian view of history. It's the same thing with the scholastic realists of the Inquisition. It's the same thing with the 18th century rationalists as well. So, sorry, I need to drink some water. So, magic, and then he goes on to give more examples about incomplete organisms, right? What doesn't work? Well, another example, other than an autonomous system like Marxism, Freudianism, he says magic without mysticism and gnosis is sorcery, okay? And then he says there is no such thing as black magic, but rather there's only sorcerers groping in the dark. It's basically, there's no such thing as black magic. They just don't have the light of gnosis and mysticism, right? They're lacking in gnosis and mysticism, but they're still performing magic. This is just what happens when you don't have the complete organism, right? Another example is the spiritual drunkard of mysticism, right? If you're a mystic and all you care about is mysticism, and you have no gnosis, you're a spiritual drunkard. So basically, he's setting up that, number one, their different methods are proper to different objects of knowledge. Okay, so there can't be just one single epistemology, right? And then he says too that a whole complete human is a mystic, a Gnostic, and a magician, and thus they're a Hermetic philosopher, right? So it involves all of these things. And before you kind of freak out about these words, what is a mystic? Well, Moses was a mystic, right? Abraham was a mystic. It's really just someone that experiences revelation, right? They have some kind of spiritual experience. What is Gnosticism? It's knowledge. That's all it is. It's knowledge. What is magic? Now this one is interesting. Magic is essentially a ritual, right? It's just like if you go to a church service, right, or something like that, that is magic. Okay. And then what's hermetic? A hermetic philosopher? Well, it's all of that bound up into one. It's a way of seeing the world through a holistic lens. Okay. So now he talks about the senses of Hermeticism. Okay. How am I doing on time? Pretty good. 25 minutes. All right. So the senses of Hermeticism. Everything has multiple senses, right? So for example, the High Priestess card, it has multiple senses, but it does have a kind of specialization, a focus on one thing. So, but the multiple senses would be the Gnostic sense, the magical sense, and something like the Hermetic-Philosophical sense, right? So, what's the Gnostic sense of the High Priestess? It is contemplation, okay, which is basically spiritual hearing. And he goes off in this whole thing about how contemplation works, but it's your spiritual ears, right? You're listening. What is the magical sense of the High Priestess? Okay, well, it's the projection. It's the projecting outward of the inner life, and that's what magic is in general. Tomberg says on the psychic plane, magic is artistic creation, right? You're drawing a painting or something. In the physical plane, magic is giving birth, right? And I like to think about how C.S. Lewis one time, when he talked about his book Till We Have Faces, he said, I was pregnant with the book, right? So C.S. Lewis understood this kind of hermetic sense. Magic and birth and art, the creation of art, these are all very intimately related. They're all the same thing, just in different planes, right? Different methods, different objects of knowledge, but they're the same thing, right? So another example of magic, Tomberg says that creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, is thus a magical act, right? There's a birth happening there. So Tomberg says the whole world is a magical act, okay? Because it's not just born once, but it's constantly sustained, right? It is an act of magic. So the Hermetic philosophical sense, then, what is that with this card? Well, it's synthesis, right? An example of synthesis and what this means is reconciling ideas, for example. So going back to creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, Tomberg goes on this whole big thing about how there's different ideas about how God relates to the world, right? And he says, well, an example of synthesis is reconciling all of these ideas about creation and how God relates to the world. So going through in order, it's very interesting. He says, pantheism, which is the idea that God is everything, right? That everything is part of God. He says pantheism is true in the world of ideas within God. Okay, so in this plane, pantheism is true. Theism is true when one leaves the uncreated to pass on to the creation, right? So the creation of archetypes that we know through experience. Okay, pantheism, theism. What about demiurge, right? The demiurgism. So the demiurge concept is true when we contemplate formation. Okay. Now, demiurge, I think, just really means formation. I think that's what the word means. Maybe I'm wrong on that. But it's true in the realm of, after creation, then it introduces some kind of demiurge system, because it is true that humans and spiritual beings were intended to be co-creators with God. So the demiurge system is true after creation, right? In the realm of forming nature, right? So human beings themselves are a kind of demiurge, right? Because they can choose to be against God or with God, right? But it's not the ultimate truth, right? So it's true in that situation. Now, then he says naturalism, materialism, is true in the realm of facts, okay? So, and the realm of facts is a little bit more vague, but it's basically just, logic, science, things like that. So the idea is that, the Hermetic philosophical sense is synthesizing all these ideas where it's picking out, okay, what is true about this, right? Well, what's true is that it's true in this way. So you're kind of able to figure out how these things fit together. So the desire of Hermeticism then is to summarize the experiences of in all the planes of reality, right? Which vary based upon where the experience takes place. Okay, so that's basically the chapter there. So I mentioned how there's all these different Hermetic senses about this one card, right? The High Priestess, but in general, these cards, the arcana, they represent primarily one main idea. So for example, the magician represents the mystical sense, okay? The High Priestess is primarily the Gnostic sense, right? Knowing, right? Taking information, disseminating it outward, and reflecting it upward, right? And the upcoming one, which is next, will be the Empress, and that's primarily about the magical sense, okay? And then the Emperor is the Hermetic philosophical synthesis sense, right? And so those four cards kind of go in order as like an introduction to the rest of the arcana. It kind of sets up, this is all of the senses that you need to understand what follows after it. So hopefully this was understandable for you guys. This was really hard to collate and bring together because Tomberg goes on so many random tangents and I had to move things around in different orders. My voice is killing me now. So stay tuned next time and we're going to talk about the Empress. Thank you.